Okay? Neuroscience contains the correct description of reality. Psychology does not. And what that really means is that whatever we talk about when we talk about the mind isn't a real thing. Okay? Rather, the world of the mind is the world of ether and phlogiston and fairies and all of these other things that are basically illusory, at best illusory concepts that in science we are better off without. In a profile of the Churchlands in the New Yorker published a couple of years ago, the following interaction was transcribed. Pat comes home after a particularly hard day at the office and says, "Paul, don't speak to me. My serotonin levels have hit bottom. My brain is awash in glucose steroids. My blood vessels are full of adrenaline. And if it weren't for my endogenous opiates, I'd have driven the car into a tree on the way home. My dopamine levels need lifting. Pour me a Chardonnay, and I'll be down in a minute." Okay? So this is what the Churchlands are advocating here in terms of grounding the psychology in the real-world findings of neuroscience. They want to get rid of all sorts of mentalistic constructs and instead substitute constructs having to do with physiology and other kinds of materialist things. Note just in passing that even they can't pull it off. Okay, Paul, don't speak to me. Speaking, I suppose it's a behavior, but really, don't speak to me as a psychological thing. And if you really wanted to ground this conversation in the real world findings of neuroscience, you'd say something quite different than that. And then down towards the bottom, pour me a Chardonnay. I don't know what that's all about, because if you really wanted to ground psychology in the real world findings of neuroscience, she just mainline ethyl alcohol or something, right? And you don't need a Chardonnay, the quintessential California, I suppose before cocaine, the quintessential California relaxing agent, much less have a devoted husband pour you one, okay? There's a social interaction there that they seem not to be able to get away from. But still, you can't fault the effort, I suppose. But this is the way they think people really ought to talk instead of using the constructs of folk psychology. Very recently, Pat Churchland published an autobiography, which is quite interesting, called Touching a Nerve, which has a wonderful double entendre to it, in which she writes, "I began to learn neuroscience in the mid-1970s after having begun a career in philosophy. The transition was motivated by the realization that if mental processes are actually processes of the brain, then you cannot understand the mind without understanding how the brain works." Again, this is what passes for intertheoretic reduction, okay, and makes it very clear that they're not interested in maintaining two theories. They're interested in getting rid of the one class of theories, psychological theories of the mind, and sticking with neuroscientific theories of the mind. Colin McGinn, reviewing this book in the New York Review of Books, says, well, look, really, okay, mind is what the brain does, and brain is operates on a bunch of physiological properties, but those physiological properties, in fact, are instantiations of the laws of physics. So why stop with neuroscience? Okay, why doesn't everybody just become a physicist of some kind? That is, seems to be the implication of their position. Okay, there's another way to think about this, which is to say, why not ground neuroscience in the real-world findings of psychology? Okay, and this, in fact, is how neuroscience operates. What cognitive neuroscience takes psychological principles, psychological laws, psychological theories as valid descriptions of the world of the mind, and then tries to find out what their neural correlates are. I'll give you one, maybe two, if I have time, good examples of this. First, let's talk about color vision, okay? Neuroscientific approaches to color vision, trying to find out exactly how color vision works. what happens in the retina, what happens in the optic nerve, what happens in the lateral geniculate nucleus, what happens in the optic chiasm, what happens in area V1 or whatever. All of that begins and is predicated on psychological theories about, say, color vision. In the 19th century, the predominant theory of color vision was the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, which began with the idea that, you can get any color from any, by mixing red, green, and blue, or red, yellow, and green, whatever, any three of these colors. And so what there ought to be are three kinds of color receptors in the retina or someplace. So they went off to look for three kinds of color receptors, and in fact they found three kinds of color receptors, one sensitive to short wavelengths, one sensitive to long wavelengths, and one sensitive to the mama bear wavelengths in the middle. But it turned out the trichromatic theory of color vision was wrong. That's not how color vision works. We now know from other psychological experiments that a better psychological theory of color is what's known as the opponent process theory of color vision, which basically says there are structures called opponent processes that take inputs from those three kinds of color receptors and then process them in various ways. What gave us the opponent process theory of color vision was not any physiological finding. What gave us the opponent process theory of color vision was the psychological phenomenon of negative after images. Okay? Work that out in the lecture supplements if you want to see it. But it was the discovery of negative after images that led people to think that, oh no, there aren't just three basic colors after all. Yellow is a basic color too. So we got to start looking for something in pairs or something in four of something. And looking for that, then people started to find these opponent processes located roughly in the lateral geniculate nucleus. But the search for the physiological basis of color vision began and was predicated on a valid psychological theory of seeing color. The psychological theory came first. So again, from my point of view, what you really want to do is to turn the Churchlandian statement around and say you want to do neuroscience, first you've got to have a valid psychological theory. But without that psychological theory, you can understand all there is to know about how neurons work and all of that kind of business, but how they function in mental life, you're just not going to get. So what we're going to do next time, is to take the reverse here. We're going to first start out with a description of what consciousness is, and then try to figure out what its neural basis might look like, starting with the psychology and then go into the neuroscience being not at all self-evident. Thank you very much. I'll see you on Wednesday.